So our first presentation, supporting students with disabilities in the inclusive Japanese classroom. Okay, I hand it over to Rebecca here.
All right, I am going to put into the chat line a link for joining the Pear Deck presentation there. And if you see that in the chat line, before I even start to share my window through the Zoom meeting, you should be able to follow that link and use your Google account to join the presentation. And like I said, this format of it will allow participants to interact a little bit more directly with me, and will allow me to show your comments or share your comments kind of anonymously, which is really helpful to me in the classroom setting. I use this tool a lot with my high school students. So let me see. How do I share my thing? Okay, there we go. Share screen. I see. Yeah. I see. Okay. All panelists. Boop, boop, boop. Looks good. And that's what I'm going to share. Okay, so now you should be able to see that. Okay, so it looks like we've got 19 of the participants currently connected to that. Ooh, a few people dipping in and out of there. But, and then as we get going with this, if there are more people who arrive in the Zoom meeting who want to join the Pear Deck session and be able to comment there, the code will remain visible in the corner of the screen. So we'll be able to help them with that. But that link that was in the chat line, I'm not sure with Zoom, since I'm more used to using Google Meet, whether the link will remain visible for people who have just joined if it was put in the chat line prior to them joining. All righty, it looks like we've got 20 people connected at this point. I'm going to close the join code in a little bit, but before I do, while I'm letting you get going there, yes, okay, perfect. All right, so just to introduce the topic, I have been teaching Japanese as a world language in high schools since 2003, and I started my career in California. I taught near to Los Angeles. But I got my training from a pretty fancy brand name university. And while I was going through a program that was master's degree in education plus teaching credential, I asked several times about how can I support students with learning disabilities and other disabilities in a world language classroom. And at the time, I got told repeatedly, you've got enough to deal with, you've got enough to learn to get ready for the classroom. And the instructors that I was working with at the time really were under the impression that students with significant learning disabilities wouldn't be in a world language class. I think that comes a lot from the fact that these teachers had been out of the classroom for a little while, and law related to access to all courses has dramatically shifted in kind of a short amount of time. All right, so let's get going with this. So I'm interested to know here, what do you think about this topic? What is the Japanese term for learning disability? I know that my training was in the United States, and a lot of my colleagues at the university level were trained in Japan. And so I do feel like when we try to discuss this topic, sometimes we don't have common vocabulary. That's one of the things that I want to work on today. Make sure that we have the ability to talk with each other because we know common vocabulary. All right, I see several colleagues typing and then adding a lot of question marks to the terms that they have put in here. All right, and if you can join the Pear Deck and put the comments in there rather than in the chat line, then you'll be able to have a record of everything later a little bit more thoroughly. All right. So yes, a lot of you, and looking through the list of participants, we've got a lot of very, very, very well-trained and competent colleagues in this meeting, and a lot of question marks here. So the Japanese term for this is gakushu shogai. Gakushu makes sense, and then shogai and disability in general. So yeah, the fact that even this really well-trained group of colleagues were not quite there on having common vocabulary. Another question, do you have students in your classes this year who have learning disabilities? Oh, okay, one second, let me put that link in again. There's the link for the Pear Deck. You should be able to click that and then use your Google account to join. Okay, and we had a couple of people actually change their opinions on this particular question. This is one where it is, at the beginning of my career, I would have always said, I'm not sure. Or no, I would have always said, nah, I am pretty certain I don't. The majority of the participants here are saying, yes, I do, absolutely I do. And statistically, it would be very surprising if you didn't. Statistically, you definitely do. We'll just, one second, my notes are not currently visible to me, one second. The number of students in, let's see, my Pear Deck is not showing me my notes on this point. Let's see, the number of students in an average year that you're going to have, yeah, you're likely to have them. I'll go back to it. We'll just leave it at that. We're good. You're likely to have students with learning disabilities for real. All right, let's move on then. The next one. What is your estimate? How many students do you think have some sort of learning disability? What is your understanding of that? All right, that's interesting. That's interesting. We don't really have any kind of consensus on this within the group. Can you give me just a second on this? I need to fix something about the way that my computer is showing things to me. So I'm going to need to shift something, and there we go. All right. This looks good. All right. It's probably higher than you anticipate, but we'll get to this. We'll get to this information a little bit. Now, I want to show you anonymously what I would say learning disabilities. I would say anybody who has an ADHD would qualify, certainly emotional disability, things that would get in the way of participating in a class without support. Okay. All right, let me show you what your colleagues responded on this, because like I said, the responses were all over the board. You can see here, we didn't really have a consensus on this. And again, looking at the list of participants, I recognize a lot of very, very experienced and well-trained colleagues here who really just aren't coming to an agreement on this. Okay. So
Sorry, Rebecca.
Yes, sir.
The screenshot is actually getting, everything's being cut a little bit strangely.
Oh, okay. So this screenshot here, is it now showing correctly?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. All right. So we're saying like I said, we've got really experienced colleagues here who are not yet coming to a consensus on this. So as we talk through today's goals, my big goals for the day, I spent a lot of time in the spring working on research specific for this because I discovered I really didn't have any knowledge of the Japanese terms for learning disabilities. I didn't really have access because of that to resources specific to supporting students in Japanese language courses. And then I thought about it a little further, realized the majority of my colleagues who are university instructors trained in Japan, so they may not know the American terms on this. So I'd like to make sure that we're kind of starting on the same page here. And I really want to start conversations with each other about how we can support each other. Like I said, I'm really feeling like I'm at the beginning of learning how to support my students in this area, even though I've been teaching for 17 years at this point. All right, so what are your goals for this session? What kind of ideas do you have? You can type your responses in English or Japanese. These will remain anonymous. So far, this is just something that I'm going to see. Hmm. All right, so we've got some responses that several people are sharing in common. Let me show you some representative ones here. So several of you mentioned wanting to know what additional support your school or your university can give you for helping these students in the classroom. This comment that is coming up second here, this is exactly what my experience was. And I'm not talking, I'm not criticizing the program that I was in necessarily. I mean, I went to Stanford. You pay a lot of money. They provided a great experience in a lot of ways. But this right here, it was a different enough thing from supporting students in English language settings that it was just, oh, we don't know what to do. And yes, and looking for more effective ways to support students in several different ways. This was showing up from several participants. Okay, all right, thank you. So let's move forward and let's take a look. So I want to look really briefly at the history of laws related to learning disabilities and the kind of the difference between how that has come through in Japan and the United States. So in the United States, in 1963, there was a conference in Chicago that was organized by parents who wanted to discuss their children's struggles in schools. And the presenter at that conference was a researcher named Dr. Samuel Kirk. And he was kind of the person who first used the term learning disabilities. After that conference, soon after that conference, the organization that's now called the Learning Disabilities Association of America was formed by the participants in that conference. So they kind of took their cues from the American Civil Rights Movement and worked hard to improve access and resources and the legal rights of their students to receive support within schools. So in 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was enacted, and the more recent version of this is something that you probably heard of, IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. But this law guaranteed free and appropriate education for all children. So just to understand how much of a revolutionary thing this was, prior to 1975, it was completely legal, and in many places it was established in law that schools didn't have to educate children who had disabilities. So, for example, there were states in the United States that said, we will educate all students, but not the ones who are blind, not the ones who are deaf, not the ones who have this or this happening. And in Columbus, Ohio, which is close to where I live, there are the Ohio School for the Deaf, Ohio School for the Blind. These were revolutionary institutions when they were established because nobody else would educate these children. So in 1975, the law changing in the United States to say, no, these children also have a right to an education. All children have a right to an education. This was revolutionary. So the law has been renamed several times. Our most recent version is the IDEA. And in Japan, the kind of parallel organization, the Japan Academy of Learning Disabilities, first held a meeting in 1992. And there's ongoing research in Japan about how to support students within the Japanese educational system, but there's not currently a law that specifically relates to supporting students with learning disabilities there. There's research on how to do this that's ongoing. That began 19 years ago, but there's still not a clearly established law saying that students in Japan have a right to an unrestricted education. There are laws related to just international civil rights and human rights law that gets applied in Japan, but there's not a domestic law there. So some of this research that's in Japan on how to support people in the Japanese language is likely to be newer than what's already established for English language. Okay. So the basics. It's about 15% of learners in American schools are estimated to have a learning disability of some sort. So statistically, you're pretty likely to have students with learning disabilities in your classes every single year. The response that we got earlier when we said, do you think that you have, or I'm sorry, how many students do you think we had? Yeah, around 15%. We weren't terrible on there, but there we have it. So it is about 15% of learners. So when I'm talking about learning disabilities, I'm talking about the way the students process and perceive information. This is something where students need support in coping with and compensating for the different ways that they process information, but it can't be cured. It's not like you're going to give one educational support like a hearing aid and now suddenly things work. This is a difference in the way students' brains function. So, and coping techniques for these students are applicable both inside and outside school and look a little different. So let's look at students' rights, because that's really the starting point here. So if you teach in a K-12 setting, you have almost definitely been in an IEP meeting or read an IEP and seen the term specific learning disability. This is a term that comes directly from the law, and it refers to the psychological process involved in processing language, involved in processing information. So it's helpful to be familiar with the specific terms in the Act, because the term specific learning disability is a legal term. I see this a lot on my students' IEPs. This doesn't include things like a physical disability that would get in the way of fully participating in an unsupported class environment. It doesn't include a mental disability like Down syndrome. It doesn't include an emotional disturbance, and it doesn't include economic disadvantage. So let me look at my notes and see what else I wanted to say there. So a specific learning disability, it doesn't include anything that's primarily the result of a physical disability. All right. So on to this. Okay, before I begin talking about how we determine whether a student's eligible for services, I need to know how many of you have participated in an IEP meeting or a formal assessment of whether a student qualifies for an IEP?
Oh, Rebecca, Joyce raised her hand. Can I allow her to talk real quick?
Yeah. I don't see where that happens. Okay, yeah.
Oh, we have to promote to panelist.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah. Go ahead, Joyce. Oh, Joyce, did you have a question? You raised your hand.
Oh, she's muted. Oh no. Yeah, please unmute. You're good.
I'm sorry. I had just joined and I was just trying to say that, yes, I have participated in IEP.
Oh,
here, Miss Joyce, let me give you the link to join in the Pear Deck. Look in the chat line there, and you can join there, and then you'd be able to click directly to do some of these interactive slide items.
Okay.
Okay, it looks like about half of our participants have never participated in the IEP process. Um, Honestly, it's not surprising to hear that our participants wouldn't have participated in an initial IEP for a student, because many students now, if they qualify, they're being identified relatively early in their educational careers. Um, but we can't assume that our students would have been identified prior to high school. We really can't. There are plenty of students who have a learning disability, who figure out compensation strategies on their own. Prior to high school, they're able to just mask it or compensate on their own, and then once they get to a higher level, suddenly they kind of crash because they aren't they don't have the invisible skills that other students have. So we can't assume that our students would have been identified before reaching our classes. So to determine if a student is eligible for services, there's a team of people who have to work together to determine if the student qualifies based on the legal terms described by IDEA. So in most states, eligibility is considered after a child has been receiving specialized intervention for a specific amount of time. So if you've heard of the response to intervention program, RTI, that's a version of what I'm referring to. So in most schools, in most states, the way that it's structured is teachers need to identify, or parents need to identify, that a student needs additional support. Then you work together with a team, including teachers, special ed, assessments from psychologists, several different types of educational professionals working together. So this can be a really long process. And part of why it's long is not because we don't want to support students, but because IDEA is a legally binding definition of what learning disabilities are. So we need to make sure that we're documenting things and making certain that a student qualifies under the definitions there. We need to make sure that the way that we are documenting the student's needs obviously meets the legal requirements. So if a learner qualifies for services, then an individualized educational plan gets written and an IEP meeting is held. Then once an IEP document is established for the student, the document's guidelines are legally binding. The classroom teachers must follow the guidelines within that IEP. Those IEP document requirements also apply to college and university students. So even if you are not aware of ever having had a student who qualified for an IEP, this is applicable for all of us. And students and their parents who have realized that they're not getting the accommodations that were written into their IEPs are well within their rights to sue the school and to sue you as an individual, and not having seen the IEP is not an excuse for it legally. So some schools do a better job or a less good job of getting that information to classroom teachers. And I can talk a little bit later on about where that information is available in my school district. But I know that different districts use different school settings use different communication methods there. So there was a colleague Yes, saying I don't even know if foreign language teachers are given access to this information, or you have to request it. So if your school's special education department is not doing a good job of proactively sending this information to you, then we need to get you good tools for finding it. Because if a student doesn't do well in your class and their family determines, well, she didn't do well and she wasn't being given extended time on tests as her IEP requires that she receive, then that is a huge problem. Okay, so we'll get to that. Well, no, a student who has an IEP, a student who has an IEP, even at the university level, the IEP is a legally binding document. So the disabilities office at your university will have information about it, but by the time students are in college or attending a university, the students themselves tend to be much more aware of their own needs, and either to advocate for themselves, or to go directly through the disabilities office to get services, rather than going to classroom teachers directly. But we do need to be aware of it. I believe the IEP document is still something that you could access and see as a university instructor. Okay, so let's look at common disabilities. And I put my best version of the Japanese terms for these. And if it turns out that I'm wrong, we'll fix it. All right, so 5 of our most common learning disabilities are right here. So when you receive this later on, you will find that these are functional links that you can follow. So one of our most common ones is dyslexia. We've got yomikaki shogai. This is one that you've probably run into, where students have a lot of trouble processing characters. This is not a reading comprehension problem. This is a decoding the characters problem. Dyscalculia, oh my goodness, this is a disability where it's somewhat similar. Students have a large amount of trouble decoding the symbols in mathematical writing. Dysgraphia and dyslographia. So dysgraphia is what you're going to see on an IEP for an American school. Dyslographia, we'll get into that a little bit later on. Dyslographia is specific to logographic writing systems like Japanese and Chinese. So we'll get into that. It's a problem with the writing systems. Auditory processing disorders and visual processing disorders. An auditory processing disorder is one where it is not a problem with the physical mechanics of the ear. It is a problem with the way that the student's brain processes information that they hear. So students with an auditory processing disorder would not be helped by a hearing aid or by sitting closer to the instructor. A visual processing disorder is similar in that glasses won't help, larger font may not help. Students have problems with the mental processing of things they see. So we'll get into these in a little bit more detail, but this is a super cool video. Oh my gosh. There's a lot of super great information happening right now with research on how the brains of kids with dyslexia and these other learning disabilities are functioning. And I don't want to show this video right now, but partly because I don't know if I will cause massive echoing, and it doesn't appear to be showing up as a clickable. Oh, it is a clickable link. Let's do it then. I'm going to mute myself here just in case I cause massive echoing. I'm going to mute myself and then play the video.
Rebecca, we cannot hear the sound. When you do share, you do have to click on the thing that says share sound.
Man, okay, one second. I'm screen sharing. Sorry, guys. Do I need to stop the share and then reshare it, do you think? I'm going to try that. I don't think that I'm accurate and that I'm actually doing that, sharing the sound.
We can try. I'll let you know if it works.
Sound. There you go. All right. Now I think it'll work. So I'm going to remute myself. I'm sorry, everybody. I'll back it up to the start of this.
In Evanston, Illinois, Dr. Nina Kraus is trying to fill in one small part of that picture.
Factors that might contribute to why a child is having difficulty reading. It's a very big puzzle, a complicated puzzle.
Reading is an extremely dynamic, complicated process. It involves the whole brain. It involves everything from looking at the word and perceiving what's on the written page to the whole brain really constructing an understanding of what's being read. What that means is that any place along that complicated trajectory or that process, something can go wrong.
Excellent job. Give me 5.
Dr. Kraus is helping to identify or to eliminate one possible cause of a child's reading struggles. That's difficulty processing sound. But what does that have to do with reading? Everything.
There's lots of room to play in.
The 26 letters of our alphabet are a code for the sounds that we make when we speak. So if we can't understand the sounds, the letters won't mean much. 8-year-old Jenna Rogers is here to see if that might be part of her problem.
Good. You ready to take some pictures of your brain? All right.
Dr. Kraus is using an old technology, EEG, in a new way. She calls her measurement a biomap. Biomap stands for biological marker of auditory processing.
What the biomap does is it measures very objectively how the brain responds to sound. We're looking at responses that are coming from the brain stem. So this is the input into the cortex.
Does that one feel okay?
The responses are involuntary. So even if a kid is having a bad day or is feeling nervous about the test, the result will not be affected.
So did you know that your brain makes electricity?
No.
These electrodes will measure how Jenna's brain responds to the sound da, as it is repeated like so. And at the same time, Jenna will be zoning out with a cartoon. As Jenna's brain quiets, Dr. Kraus can get a clearer picture of how Jenna's brain waves respond.
That's rather atypical, so it really seems as though she's reflecting, she's representing sound in perhaps her own unusual way.
Jenna's brain detects sound a little more slowly than most, and that could be part of her problem with reading.
These lines here represent the brain waves from normal kids, and then these come from dyslexic kids. You can just see how the timing is jittered, how the waves are shifted over. The difference here, we're talking about tenths, fractions of milliseconds.
Why would such a tiny difference matter? Well, it turns out that the difference between sounds like those made by the letters B and P is contained within a tiny span of time. So if your brain doesn't process fast enough, you can't distinguish between the two.
If the child cannot hear that difference between the B and the P sound, and the parents are talking to them and saying, bat the ball, pat the cat, they might be thinking that, oh, bat the ball, bat the cat. And all cat lovers will tell you that's unacceptable.
How about say? Where are you going to put say?
With the new information about Jenna's auditory processing, Kit Harper, her tutor, is focusing more on helping Jenna learn to discriminate between sounds. She's essentially training Jenna's brain to hear more accurately.
Wait, it goes. Can you say the sounds while you make it?
We learn to speak new languages and sing new songs throughout our life. Just as you can train your brain to hear sounds differently as you learn to study a musical instrument, well, if you know which sounds are not being represented well, you can train your brain to hear these sounds in a more accurate fashion.
Peekaboo.
Hey guys, what's up? So I am super into this website right now. It's Generation.
Yeah, I don't care what that woman has to say about anything, though. 1 second. Let me pull back. Let me pull back to the presentation that I was showing before. 1 second, guys, because I don't care what that young woman had to say. Oh, I've lost my window for a sec here, guys. There we go. Okay, I need to restart the sharing of that. There we go. All right. So, like we saw in that short video, there's a lot of research that is showing how dyslexia happens and what is actually going on internally. So dyslexia is showing up with struggles with really specific language skills. So before I give my summary of what dyslexia is, can you type your own explanation of what do you think is going on with dyslexia? What are the symptoms that you've seen? What is your understanding of dyslexia?
We had a request if you could please repeat the question.
Okay, could you give me your explanation of what you think is going on with dyslexia? What have you seen in students who are dyslexic? What is your understanding of dyslexia? Right, so we've got several people who are mentioning that similar looking sounds or similar similar sounding characters get confused for these students. And because of that, it takes a while to process what they're seeing. So they might flip letters that look similar to each other. They might reverse things. And they're having trouble connecting the sounds of a word to the characters in front of them. And then because of that, they're not reading as fluently. It takes time to process it. But the same students, if they hear the same level of content, could process it a lot more easily. So it's a specific language skills, and like you saw in that video, the children or the students who are experiencing this, it's taking a little bit longer to process sounds, a little bit longer to deal with it. So in Japanese, the term dyslexia, that's hard for me to say, katakana de, dyslexia, is often used. But I've also seen the term yomikaki shogai, which is easier for me to understand since it just says what it is. So the incidence in Japanese speakers is pretty low, especially compared to native English speakers. And honestly, the Dyslexia Association of Japan, I think that's the name of it, when you look at their website to see how to support people in Japanese, a lot of the strategies that they have are based on teaching students who read English to analyze words based on phonic chunks. So phonics is a very effective approach to reading for all kids, but especially dyslexic kids. So in Japan, in the past few years, this book, Yomenakute mo kakenakute mo benkyou shitai, this is a book by Inoue Satoru. And so there's been more public attention to the issue in Japan in the past few years as that book came out. But one of the most interesting things that I found when I was looking into this, that is the difference between dyslexia symptoms in speakers of English and in speakers of Japanese. So the symptoms of dyslexia are dramatically different. You can see this here. Okay, so when native speakers of Japanese, young speakers of Japanese, are reading and trying to decode, and they're only using kana, the symptoms of dyslexia are only showing up in about 2 to 3% of readers. And you can see in native speakers of English, it's showing up in 5 to 10% of readers of English. Even when you add in kanji for slightly older children, in native speakers of Japanese, symptoms of dyslexia only appear in 5 to 6% of readers. So this is really interesting to me. But as I was looking into this, what I discovered, there's a lot of research into what's called the orthogonal depth of a language. Hiragana is an exceptionally shallow language, an exceptionally transparent language, because when you see ah, it sounds like ah. When you see the letter A written in English, it could sound like so many different things. So English is what is called an exceptionally orthographically opaque or deep language. English doesn't have good consistent, not good. It doesn't have very consistent transfer of sounds into letters. And a lot of that is because of the way that words have been borrowed into English. So, so we often get told that students with dyslexia find it really difficult to learn a new language compared to other students. But the research is pointing to something different for our language. So, and then I found some other stuff that is pointing to the idea that some students who have significant symptoms of dyslexia in English don't have as severe symptoms in Japanese. So it might actually be significantly less difficult than is often assumed. And that's anecdotal to a certain extent, but I think that we are in a really, really good position to work with special education teachers to support learners and to destigmatize the reputation that Japanese has as a difficult language that they should be steering special ed students and specifically dyslexic students away from. I don't think that that perception is valid. And I had a question that I was going to ask you, and I've changed my mind. So don't worry about that text field there. All right. So let's move forward. So some of the strategies that are frequently suggested for supporting students with dyslexia are things that we as teachers of a world language are doing for all of our students, because we have to teach them how to perceive the sounds in a new language. We have to teach them what sounds are important in Japanese that don't match their first language. So assistive technology is often provided for or suggested for dyslexic students. We need to think very carefully in our classes about the goal of an assignment or the goal of an assessment. If the goal is to assess the student's ability to decode characters, then it's appropriate to ask them to read characters. If the goal of an assessment is to find out if they can process a story or a news article and understand the content of it, then it could be appropriate to give them access to technology that would read the text out loud, for example. If the assessment is not trying to figure out whether students can write characters, then it's very appropriate to give them access to things like text to speech and speech to text. So I really ask you to consider the ways in which you can do that with your courses now. And especially now that many of us are teaching online and getting more familiar with technology tools that would allow a student to, for example, speak into their phone and have it, that dictation, show the Japanese characters immediately. I really encourage you to consider where that is appropriate. One of the things that is especially tough for students who are dyslexic is understanding of grammar. We teach that overtly, hooray. But one of the big resources that I've had a lot of success with is this one that I'm showing you, English Grammar for Students of Japanese, and I suggest that. So one of the goals of ACTFL standards is to get students to thoughtfully compare their own first language to the new language that they are studying. So carefully and thoughtfully planning for that comparison is not just a good way of meeting ACTFL's standards and in Ohio, the state standards, but it is also going to, along the way, support dyslexic students. I keep coming back to it, but I feel like a lot of the things that are recommended as supports for students with learning disabilities are things that are just really good teaching practice in a world language class. Okay.
Oh, we had a quick comment from Margaret.
Yes. Okay.
So a little bit long. I don't know about dyslexia, but regarding distinguishing and production of speech sounds, it seems that isolating and comparing sounds so that the person can hear the sound can assist in the actual production of the sound. Japanese kana sound to symbol correspondence is extremely accurate, whereas English sound to symbol correspondence is not accurate and it's more like a guessing game. And she asks, what is the difference between decoding and reading characters?
Okay, decoding is the ability to look at something that's written down and take that information and understand the word or the sound that it represents. Okay, so when you look at a word written down, looking at it and understanding its meaning, rather than just looking at it as a series of shapes. That's the decoding part of it. And I absolutely agree about the getting students practice with hearing the sounds one at a time is very, very helpful for helping them to even hear it. And that's in that video, we were seeing the tutor doing that with the student and having her break down a word into its phonic chunks and line them up. This is another one where the technology that we've got access to will give us some of these tools, even free things like building flashcard sets in Quizlet give us access to this, where it can be read out loud and break it down that way. Because of the direct one-to-one correspondence between hiragana and sounds in Japanese, I don't use Romaji after the very beginning of Japanese 1. We are done with Romaji. And that shift has helped my dyslexic students immeasurably. Because if you think about it, at the start of Japanese 1, if you're teaching your kids Romaji, that's one skill. And then if you're teaching them hiragana, that's a separate skill. And so what's the benefit of teaching them Romaji? A lot of teachers have explained it as, well, Romaji is easier, but it's not. It's really not. It's just a whole separate thing. And since if you look at like textbooks that are written with Romaji portions in it, there are so many different systems of Romaji. This year, I have some students who have lived in Spanish-speaking countries in the past and got started with trying to learn some Japanese. And the Romaji that they were looking at was based on what works for Spanish. The Romaji, if you think about some of the commonly used textbooks that we have access to in the United States, there's just different Romaji for different purposes and different authors. Yeah, yep. I'm scrolling back a little bit. Yep. Yes, okay. I feel like I'm all caught up on the comments now. I put that window a little to the side. So dyslexia and dysgraphia often go hand in hand for students, because if you're having trouble hearing those distinct sounds, then you might also be having trouble with matching those two characters when you're creating them. And this is another one where technology can be a huge help. So dysgraphia is a specific disorder in students' ability to write by hand, but it can also extend more generally to typing as well. in the case of Japanese and other languages that use meaning-based characters, there's a subtype of dysgraphia called dyslographia. And that refers to learners' difficulties writing kanji or other meaning-based systems. And obviously, students who are studying Japanese are going to need to learn kana and kanji in order to be able to read authentic text and communicate with authentic audiences. I use the Genki text has Romaji in lessons 1 and 2, and then Sayonara to Romaji as of lesson 3. A lot of K-12 teachers use Adventures in Japanese in the United States. And I think the first half of book 1 uses Romaji along with hiragana and katakana. And the second half of book 1, it's Sayonara Romaji. But Romaji feels like an extra skill for many of us. For my students, apps that require the student to physically trace the characters have been really, really helpful. And if you can get something where it's kind of a game type of a thing that is motivating for them. One of my favorite ones is a web app called Skritter, but it's kind of expensive. It's a really, really good one. This is one that we got access to as an institutional subscription last spring, and my students loved it. And so I'm looking for funding for it for this year as well. It's great. So another useful support for your students who have dysgraphia as part of what's going on for them. Let them type whenever they can. Whenever creating the character is not the goal of the assignment, allow them to type or allow them to dictate verbally and have the computer do voice to text. For me, I'm a high school teacher. I'm preparing students to take the AP Japanese exam. I've been preparing them for it's at least 15 years that I've been doing that. And the AP exam for Japanese and Chinese is a computerized exam. So if you're preparing students to take an AP exam, you have to have them include typing skills and computer skills there as well. So it already has to be part of my classes. But another effective support for students who have problems with dysgraphia is to teach the process of writing. And maybe by the time they're in high school, you feel like, well, come on now, don't you know how to write? But a lot of very, very bright and successful high school students don't do the process of brainstorm, organize, plan, then write. For a student who has trouble with dysgraphia, that process takes a lot of the stress out of it and makes it a much more manageable thing. Okay. Yeah, I love Skritter. I hope I get funding for that. Man, I gotta write a grant. Because they loved it. They were like, Sensei, did you see what I did? I was like, yes, I did. And I didn't have to do anything with it. It was great. There are a couple of really good ones. Kana Bimoji is great. I can't remember which of our colleagues worked on Kana Bimoji. That's a free one for Android and iOS. Yes, I love Kana Bimoji. Okay, moving on. Dyscalculia. Oh my goodness. So the importance of muscle memory in learning to physically produce the characters, and also the association of the kinesthetic practice plus the recall of it, it is very, very valuable, absolutely. And so going back several comments to another colleague who was saying we need to break this down and make sure that students are understanding the individual sounds, processing the individual sounds. Like I said, I'm strongly encouraging students to use apps that require them to physically write the characters, not just look at them and identify them. I'm trying to seek a balance for that myself, because in the past I have overlapped so many skills in one task to the detriment of my students who had learning disabilities. And now that I'm pulling it apart a little bit more and saying, okay, can you verbally tell me what the vocabulary is? Okay, so I can see that part of your skill is solid. And then over here, can we do the physical practice of the characters and get that as a separate thing? Pulling those skills apart is allowing them to be more successful, build up their confidence, and as was said earlier, to hear the sounds that are used to build Japanese words. All right. Dyscalculia is one that until quite recently, when I saw it on an IEP, I kind of discounted its relevance to my subject, honestly. So you can see here, so dyscalculia, it's mathematical processing. It's about logical organization, telling time, using money, things like that. Can you give me your thoughts? How do you think dyscalculia might impact a student's work in Japanese class?
Oh, I had a little bit of issue with this. I think to actually submit the answers, you have to click on add another response on the Peer Deck, and then does it actually submit your answer? Like, how does that work, Rebecca?
I mean, I can see in my presenter view of it, I can see the ellipsis of somebody writing.
Okay, so you don't actually have to do anything to make it.
No.
Okay.
I can see as people are writing.
Awesome. Just want to make sure.
Yeah, there's yeah. Okay, so notice here that logical organization is a big part of dyscalculia. So, so logical organization there is a huge part of what we are asking them to do when you are doing any task that asks them to sort things, or when you are asking them to do tasks that are sequencing actions. So when we're doing things like grammar where you have a cause and effect, grammar where you have sequence of actions, 朝起きて朝ごはんを食 That's a logical sequence of actions. And that kind of logical sequence can be super difficult for students. There are a lot of things when we're asking students to do calculation skills, believe it or not, even when you're starting your class with calendar stuff, you're asking the students to do a calculation there. When you're saying, hi, 今日は何月何日ですか? Even just saying, okay, 11月. For somebody who doesn't have dyscalculia processing problems, that's, okay, whatever. 13日です. Oh, wait a minute. 14日です今日. But that's a logical sequencing question. Some people mentioned very early in level 1, we're teaching vocabulary related to time. We're teaching vocabulary related to various counting systems. We're teaching vocabulary related to counting suffixes. So these really do show up really early in learning Japanese vocabulary. So it can absolutely show up in, ooh, I like that one too. Letters.chu.works. I like that one, yes. So when you are asking students to do tasks that are in any way related to number processing, it helps a lot to have concrete visuals that they can relate to. If you just say to them for the calendar information, hi, 今日は何月何日ですか? And you don't have it up there, that's an extra challenge for the students with dyscalculia. If you've got it physically showing, that is more of a support than you may realize. So show visuals. If you are doing a task where somebody goes to the store and needs to buy something, use play money, use visuals that show the money. Anytime that you can. Okay, let me share this. Okay, panelists and attendees, this one is a website that was suggested. It's similar to Kanabimoji and it's a free one. Okay. Yeah, if it's something that would be useful to everybody, make sure that you select panelists and attendees in the chat line. Yeah, if you're using any type of sequencing or numbers, having visuals, having cards that they can organize physically will help a lot. Now that we're working in mostly a digital setup, there are still things that you can do that would have kids drag. I say kids, and I realize that a lot of you teach adults. There are still things you can have your students do that would be dragging pictures in different ways. You can do that on tasks that use a Google slide, for example, and have them physically drag pictures. Within a learning management system, you can often have students physically drag images to put them in order. That can be a big support for students who have problems with logical organization. Okay. Next up, we got visual processing disorders. These guys, man. I got students who are, 4 years into studying Japanese that are like, nope, those are obviously the same character. And this stuff, so visual processing disorder, it can be a big problem with discriminating between things that look similar to each other. So this is one where that muscle memory piece of practicing kana by physically writing them helps a lot. The physical tracing of it helps a lot. Students with visual processing disorders can have problems understanding the relationship between the whole and parts of a compound thing. So I mentioned here having trouble understanding the difference between, or the relationship between the pieces in a kanji that uses multiple bushu. Actually, it's not bushu if it's not the primary identifier, is it? Anyway, you know, the relationship between the pieces to it. Students might have trouble distinguishing which piece goes where in a complex kanji this way. So visual processing disorders, there are some really straightforward supports we can give them. Larger print helps. Using educational fonts helps enormously. I like to have those cute fonts, but they're not always that helpful. There are fonts, educational fonts, that include line order and direction for every character. Those fonts help enormously. And while I'm working mostly in computer-based stuff, I'm finding myself typing things up for my students, saving it as a PDF so I can retain that font, and then sharing it to them. Guidelines like in Genko Yoshi help a lot for students who have visual processing disorders as well, if they're being asked to write by hand. Which education font do you recommend? Was just asked. There is, now there are a few Kyoiku fonts out there. There's one that I'll share with you in a little bit. I've got a few. I'll put that in a folder on Google Drive and share that with you all later. There's one called Kanji Stroke Order, which is commonly used handwriting style font that has the numbers at the start of everything, and it includes a lot of kanji. That's a very good one. But I'll share some ideas in a little bit. All right, and then auditory processing disorder is our last one here. No, it's our second to last one, sorry. This is one where I feel like we do a pretty good job with it, because we as Japanese educators are aware that kite, kite, and kite sound different to a Japanese speaker, but they're very difficult for an English speaker to hear. So I feel like we do a good job of practicing this, byoin versus byoin. We do a pretty good job of being aware that these are tough details for students to notice and process. But we need to be aware that a student with an auditory processing disorder will have a lot of trouble remembering something if they only hear it. So you need to make sure that you're supporting them by having both visuals and auditory at the same time. Again, going back to the AP exam, the listening comprehension section on the AP exam doesn't have visuals. So you can, so encouraging students to make notes by hand when they have a situation where they can't have visuals can support them enormously as well. And then our last guy here, finally, nonverbal learning disorders. Oh my goodness, this one. 65% of language is estimated to be nonverbal. So we need to be very, very aware of students who have what are considered nonverbal learning disorders. This would also apply to students who are autistic, if you look here at what this is describing. So students with nonverbal learning disorders have significant trouble adapting to new situations. They have trouble noticing and reacting appropriately to nonverbal cues. And in some cases, this is something that develops later in life because of minor brain injuries. So students who got concussions during sports can develop nonverbal learning disorders. So that can be an especially tough aspect of it, because these students who were just fine earlier in their lives now don't understand social situations in the same way. So this can be a very emotionally difficult learning disorder for students. The nonverbal aspect of learning Japanese, I feel again like we do a pretty good job with, because we are aware that nonverbal aspects of Japanese language and culture are different than the nonverbal aspects of American English. So we're aware of it and we teach it a little bit more overtly. I have a few times felt like that has helped especially some of my autistic students to really be on an equal playing field to their classmates, because we're overtly teaching it to them. But predictable schedules, taking the guesswork out of communication by being predictable, by having very clear and direct instructions, helps enormously. Don't ask students to infer what you expect of them. And I know that culturally that can be tough, because in both American and Japanese cultures, there are aspects of communication that we don't want to clearly line out because it feels rude. So to support these students, though, the most useful thing is to be very straightforward about what we want of them. Cooperative learning settings can be really helpful for them, because it gives these students a clear structure, about how to interact with their peers. And then many of the students we're going to work with might have multiple disabilities going on. But the big goal, really, we need to think about what is the actual goal of any task that we are working on with them, and break it down into the specific targets. All right. We're running low on time here. So I'm speeding up a little bit. Earlier in the presentation, somebody mentioned that the dyscalculia could cause trouble with students' organization. This also shows up in IEPs as executive function. I have a lot of students with executive function on their IEPs. So this is one of the most common things for me to see on IEPs, honestly. So these are students who have difficulty planning, organizing, and managing their time and managing their physical resources. So that kid who shows up with everything she has received all semester jammed into her backpack in no order. Those are all part of an executive function. You probably can think of several people in your life who are really intelligent, who just, we need to make sure we're not accidentally penalizing students for a learning disorder here. So we need to make sure that when we have long-term goals, we've got checklists, we've got things broken down into subtasks, and we are checking in on the steps along the way. And I know that for some of us that can feel like, well, that's just, come on, developmentally, aren't they there yet? But I think that's kind of confusing the developmental stage for a particular age group and a different brain function. So using and frequently showing calendars, frequently showing upcoming due dates is really helpful. It really helps these students just to have regular check-ins, even if they're not behind, just to have that regular check-in. I've got office hours literally every weekday at 1 o'clock, and I've got some students who really do just check in to say, am I okay? Can I double check with you what's coming up? And it's helped them. So yes, office hours are fantastic, hooray. Even for high school teachers, all right. one thing I wanted to make sure to do today as part of our conversation is to try to connect the participants with other participants who have resources on some of this stuff. So actually, let me skip ahead. It's about here. All right, I swear I have speaking skills. All right, so could you please give me any response you have? Which of these topics do you want to know more about? And which of these topics do you feel like you could help other people with? Because in some of the fonts here, I can't English anymore either. In some of the comments here, I have seen several really great ideas. And I'm sure that there are people who have fantastic resources about some of these things that I just haven't seen. Okay, so when we finish with this portion of this, I will click the button to directly send you the PDF version of this, and that will give you the links to. Let's see. I've got a few pages of links to articles online about some of these topics. So so some of these things talking about some of these disabilities that specific to Japanese, you'll be able to find some of that information there. And a few of you have said, well, I need to think about this. I'm not quite sure yet. I'd like to be able to show you how I access student information, but I need to think about how to do that in a way that doesn't accidentally violate my students' privacy. Obviously, I can't show you something that would display a student name. Yes. So several of you have questions that you'd like to work together with others, figuring out how to adapt lessons to make it more supportive for students. Some people are saying, I don't even know yet. Oh my goodness. Which is totally valid. And at the college level, I do think some of this is a little bit different in terms of if students, if students choose to not accept extended time, for example, that and at the high school level as well, I'm required to offer, for example, extended time. I have a lot of students who on their IEPs, they have to be given the opportunity to use extended time, for example. But if they decide to not use that extended time, that doesn't mean that I've violated their rights. So at the college level, sometimes instructors just aren't aware of it because the students aren't speaking up and saying, hey, I'd like to take advantage of what I'm allowed in my IEP. All right, let's see. So what you've written in this slide, I'm going to keep anonymous, and I'll be looking to connect people later on. But like I said, here's my Oshimai slide. We've got bunches and bunches of references. And then if you really aren't yet familiar with Irastoya for your clip art, I'm just kind of surprised, but so you have the clip art references there as well. But I've forgotten, Laura, what kind of time are we looking at? Do we have time to have some Q&A right now, or do we want to move on to a break for now? I'm not certain what we want to do for the moment.
Well, we can see if anyone has questions, and we will just have to keep it to the Q&A or the chat section. Chat might be easiest.
Okay.
Just make sure that, it's all panelists and attendees. It's that little box right above your message. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, go ahead and, shoot them out right now. And if not, we can go into a break. And if anyone thinks of any questions, while on break, because sometimes when we let, information simmer, we go get a coffee, then we're like, oh my gosh, we can accept questions about this presentation after we come back from the break. And then if there's nothing, we'll go into the presentation.
Absolutely.
Okay, so questions. I had a quick question for you, Rebecca. Have you noticed that certain skills, obviously there's so many different disabilities, but have you noticed of some disabled students that they are really good at actually reading and writing the hiragana, katakana, and kanji more so than?
I've noticed in the past couple of years that once the students who are dyslexic realize how consistent hiragana is, they feel very motivated to start learning it. And so I have, within the past few years, noticed that we can't do it this year, but in past years, I'll do early in year one, games like Karuta, where I'm calling out hiragana and they're trying to find it and slap it faster than their classmates. The students who were feeling quite nervous at the beginning of the course, okay, I'm going to end screen share so that you can see my face. The students who are dyslexic are moving from start of the year feeling quite nervous and a little self-conscious about anything that's a writing skill, to then feeling very confident once they realize that that is something that they are not disadvantaged on. And in the past 2 years, I've been very overt with mentioning, I realize at the start of a course that learning hiragana characters, it's a big list of things to learn, and we're going to support each other in learning this. But look, here's why we're going to do this, and it's going to be so helpful to know that every time you see ku, it sounds like ku, no matter what. Oh my gosh, it will. Yeah, that has definitely been noticeable. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, any questions? Oh, yep, we did get one from Alexandria. Do you want to read it, Rebecca?
So does learning Japanese with its less dense characters and language, hiragana for example, cause students with certain disabilities to show less progress in English? So as in, do they start to prefer Japanese, which affects their English performance? I realize this isn't an either or situation for foreign language, but I can see that being a question brought up by those who aren't familiar with this. So this is a kind of question that is asked usually with primary language acquisition. So small children who are learning a home language or multiple home languages and attending school primarily in another language. And what the research keeps showing is that learning more than one language at a time for small kids doesn't really slow down any one of them. And if I'm remembering correctly, there are different things that different languages express more easily. And so, in your life, bilingual people in your life who have been bilingual since childhood might prefer to talk about a particular topic in one language or the other. I've noticed in my high school aged EL students that the grammar of one language might sometimes interfere with the second language, but not to the extent that it's not understandable. I've had some students who end up with English expression or Japanese expression that sounds really poetic, because in the other language that they use, that's just how you do it. But I've looked into this a little bit, not as much as I have with adding a second language in elementary school, middle school, as I've looked at multiple languages from birth. But it doesn't really seem to slow either language down. Yep.
Okay, so it seems like there's no other questions, so we're gonna go on break right now.